going into 2020 and in all the lead-up debates and attempts to negotiate the targets for 2030, that the world wasn't going to meet the 2020 targets. And while there have been some successes and some reversals, the overall trend is one of decline and overall trends of negativity. And there's been some responses from the conservation movement. There have been very high-profile initiatives like Half Earth and 30 by 30, and also the EU strategy for biodiversity. But one of the problems with those is that they tend to repeat the existing failed models and may even reverse the gains that have been made in many places around participation, community-led conservation, Indigenous knowledge, land rights and ownerships. And so what we've seen as well with the pandemic this year is that that's really highlighted problematic relations between human and non-human worlds, and that are produced by capitalist logics, but also by various different forms of oppression and the legacies and processes of oppression produced by colonialism, but also by racism, homophobia, ableism, sexism, and so on. And 4 years ago, I presented plans for the Biosec project because it was just about to begin in Wageningen in the very first POLLEN conference. And now that unfortunately our project funding has ended in August, it now seems very fitting that we finish with a plenary panel that's about looking towards the future. And I wanted to thank the POLLEN organisers for allowing us to do this. And POLLEN itself as a conference and as the sort of POLLEN Secretariat only happens because of people who are absolutely dedicated to their intellectual endeavours, but are also very engaged academics and endeavour to be engaged in activism that comes with the belief in their intellectual projects. And so today we've got 4 great speakers. The first thing to say is that unfortunately Anne Vu can't join us. And that's a combination of the UK's hostile environment for international workers and the COVID pandemic. So Anne, because her contract ended, had to leave the UK very swiftly, but because of the pandemic, there are no direct flights to Vietnam. So she's had to go to a third country. And I'm really sorry that Anne can't join us today, but very fortunately, Giorgio Dikescu has agreed to step into her place at very late notice, and I'm sure he'll give us a great talk as well. So our first speaker will be Karina Wyborn, who's the co-lead author of the Revisiting Biodiversity report, and she'll be talking about revisiting biodiversity futures. And second, we have Mathew Mobelli, who'll be talking about what is a desirable conservation future. And third, we'll have Hannah Dickinson, who'll be talking about geopolitical ecologies. And finally, George, who's Iordăchescu, has stepped in place of Anne Vu, who'll be talking about the trouble with the EU biodiversity strategy. So, the trouble with EU wilderness. So I'll pass over to Karina first, and each one of our speakers will have around about 10 to 15 minutes. I'd ask everybody to hold on questions unless there's something really urgent, so that we can have a whole panel discussion at the end. So we'll let all 4 speakers speak first, and then afterwards, please use the chat box to post your questions, and Amber will moderate the chat. So first off, I'll hand over to Karina if you'd like to go ahead.
All right. So I'm really, really excited to be here for this panel today, and really, really thankful to Rosaleen for inviting me to talk on something that I really am quite passionate about. So as I was thinking about what it might be that I would talk about today, I started reflecting on, the year that has been 2020 and the disruptions and sort of windows into potentially terrifying futures that it has brought. And it reminded me of a conversation that I had with a really good friend of mine back in January about the Australian fires, as we were trying to grapple with that major event that was just so confronting and so terrifying for all of us. And I was living in the United States at the time, so I wasn't actually experiencing this reality on a daily basis. I was really just absorbing it and being very traumatized by it through watching the media and talking to my friends about their experiences. And this dear friend of mine had been evacuated from her coast house with her parents, and had, you know, fled for her fear of her safety, like so many other people had done. And we were talking later as she was trying to sort of make sense of all of this experience about what this event might mean for the kinds of futures that we may see in Australia, and what it continued summers like that or continued fire events like that might do to the landscapes and places that we've cared about as throughout our whole lives. And I started talking to her about the work that I do and the way in which a lot of that's focused on trying to have conversations with people about what radically different biodiversity futures might look like. And one of my kind of ongoing frustrations with the conservation community in that space is an inability to focus on the bigger picture, a sort of focus on, you know, threatened species and cute and furries. I see often leaves us not seeing the forest for the trees when it comes to climate and biodiversity. And she just responded in this really deadpan way, you know, that I need to be able to grieve. I need to be able to grieve for what was there and what's been lost. And the way that you're talking about it just doesn't enable me to do that. And it made me realise just how desensitized I've become to maps like this. So this is a map of ecosystem turnover in Australia and projecting out to 2070 for a relatively on-track emissions scenario. So basically the way to read this map is the darker the purple, the more the change. So the message that it's trying to communicate to us is that everything is just going to look really, really, really different. So wearing my political ecology hat, I could tell you about the sort of politics of the way that these kinds of maps are made, the embedded assumptions about relationships between people and institutions and landscapes that convey particular types of futures and that have very real implications for how we make decisions about biodiversity, how we make decisions about biodiversity futures. When I'm using maps like this as a practitioner, I would use it to sort of create a moment where we destabilise the present, where you put this in front of people and you just say, okay, like, hold on a minute, your future is potentially going to look profoundly different. How do we deal with that? And so from there, we sort of try to initiate conversations with people about how to address this potentially radically different future. And part of that is working with people to think about the values that they have for those landscapes or a particular place, and whether or not it's possible to maintain some of those values even as the species composition or species assemblages are changing, which is a difficult conversation for conservation because, you know, it's predicated on the assumption that we're trying to stop change. So often one of the issues that you face in practical climate adaptation planning is that often strategies that might be put in place to resist the change can make dealing with long-term changes more difficult. So to make this tangible, say trying to prevent the transition of a permanent wetland into an ephemeral wetland could mean diverting water from other wetlands or other parts of a river system. And that can also make the eventual transition into an ephemeral wetland much more difficult in that really radical future where there's really just no water, and that transition happens really quickly and the species may not cope with that, and so therefore perceived conservation failure. But the flip side of that is to think about managing these transitions to minimise the negative impacts that they might face. But adopting strategies like that requires us to accept that there's going to be some kind of loss. And so, you know, returning to the conversation with my friend, maps like this really don't help us engage with that. They don't help us engage with the tangible and the political and the sort of social and cultural implications of change. So a few weeks after this conversation, I found myself here at Bellagio in Italy at the Rockefeller Foundation for one of the last conversations for the Biodiversity Revisited initiative. Feel a little bit self-conscious putting this image in front of a political ecology conference because, you know, there we go. Conversations about the future of biodiversity are had by people in places like this. But putting that aside, although I will say that that kind of critique is very necessary when we're talking about how we think about biodiversity futures, who does the imagining with what knowledge and from which places really matters. But Biodiversity Revisited. So this was a 2-year global initiative, and the goal of the initiative was to critically examine the biodiversity construct, to think creatively about the future. It was a genuinely collaborative endeavour. We had 6 meetings and a whole series of different written inputs to help us to think about what just and desirable biodiversity futures might look like and what has been done in the past and how we can learn from that. So our meeting in Bellagio happened a week before the Italian COVID-19 outbreak hit the media. So, you know, beavering away in our little piece of paradise, we were largely unaware of what was unfolding around us. And we spent 3 days deliberating about the kinds of futures that might play out for biodiversity. And basically what we were doing was trying to understand which aspects of kind of contemporary conservation discourse may take hold in the future, which ones may fall by the wayside. So, you know, as you can see from this sort of schematic, this picture here, we had 130 of these little different cards. So there's things like novel ecosystems, biodiversity offsets, degrowth, half Earth was in there somewhere. And as is always the case with these kinds of participatory conversations, it led us into the space of realising that the people in the room at that point in time had very different interpretations of what a desirable future might look like. Is half Earth a good thing or a bad thing? Does, you know, broad scale climate impacts on biodiversity justify climate mitigation interventions that might have very localised impacts on biodiversity? So, you know, this gets us to another one of the points that I think is really important when thinking about the future is what is a desirable biodiversity future is entirely subjective. So in distilling this material, we landed on 3 distinct worlds: basic needs, wildlife rules, and climate first. So in, you know, basic needs was the sort of social justice inequality social justice and equality scenario. So focused around radical economic interventions, degrowth, those kinds of things. Wildlife rules is your classic kind of fortress conservation with a little bit of a sort of tech military drones kind of angle to it. And then climate first was where, you know, climate being the major environmental challenge of this time is the dominant narrative, and biodiversity really only matters insofar as it can enable climate mitigation efforts. In designing the different worlds, we really didn't want to have a sort of overly normative single good scenario versus the single bad scenario, and that really annoyed some people. I think people wanted to really like one of the scenarios, and they found themselves being a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that there were the bits that they liked about some and bits that they hated about that same scenario. And that choice was intentional because the future is obviously going to be a composite of the good and the bad, and aside from anything else, the good and the bad is subjective, and aside from anything else, I mean, we don't have the agency to make the decision about what might play out. I mean, I think COVID has been a really great example of these sort of uncertainties and cascading impacts that we just could not have foreseen in some contexts. There were other people who wanted the futures to be much worse than they were. You know, I had one colleague who said these worlds, they need to be so bad that they shock people into taking the IPBES report seriously. And, you know, again, that was intentionally not the track that we took because that's so disempowering, and that sort of shock and awe scenario really hasn't played out particularly well. And also, you know, like I said, the future is going to be a composite of good and bad. The other thing that people found frustrating about the scenarios is that they wanted to understand more about the decision points and the pathways, which we had intentionally left ambiguous. And our idea there was that, you know, we wanted people to do the work of having a think about what were the choices and trade-offs that were made, who had power, which ideologies were dominating. We didn't see that the role of these worlds was to presuppose those kinds of decisions. So, you know, hope and agency feel so intangible right now. I'm sure I'm not alone in finding the multitude of events of 2020 to be really quite oppressively depressing. But at the same time, they feel really important. I think it's particularly paralysing because we feel so out of control with COVID, and also just, you know, the kind of reckoning with the notion that years of advocacy and activism and really excellent insights and knowledge and research have gone largely unnoticed, or not unnoticed, but, you know, they're not precipitating the kinds of responses that we want. But as a consequence of these, you know, multiple intersecting crises, we find ourselves in a situation where we have to acknowledge that the future is going to be sort of potentially suboptimal from what we would like it to look like. Species are going to be lost. Landscapes, places, communities, cultures are going to be threatened and changed. But, you know, change is normal, right? It's part of the way in which the world, social and ecological kind of dynamics have played out over time, but it's this sort of pace of change that's so confronting. And I think one of the things that I'm really reckoning with is the need to make space for grief in all of this, particularly if we're going to get to a position where we can, you know, adopt the compositionalist ideas of Latour and others to love our monsters. I don't think we can do that until we've grieved really for what was there. But I think you also need to kind of consider whose monsters are these. You know, does the notion of loving your monsters make way for rampant development that gets justified on the fact that, you know, these systems have been intervened in and changed? And it kind of brings me to the notion that, well, maybe it's actually less about loving monsters and more about institutions that can keep in check the fact that governments aren't governing for the citizens of today anymore, let alone for the sort of multi-species assemblages of the future. And that train of thinking that gets me into the space of understanding how decisions are made based on whose knowledge and whose values, why I'm finding the rise of this emergency rhetoric, emergency climate emergency, biodiversity emergency, water emergencies really concerning. I think, as we've seen around the world, COVID as an emergency has led to authoritarian responses from governments, the increasing power of the state to invade our personal lives, little signs everywhere telling us how to wash our hands and how many people we're allowed to have in our house. And the kinds of reactive policies that I don't see as creating the inclusive and participatory and enduring space that might enable us to grapple with the challenges that we face in the future. So I find myself feeling like emergency frames may be doing some work to raise the profile of issues within some communities, but I'm not really sure that emergency modes of governing is really where we need to go. So, in conclusion, I'm feeling very confused about all of this at the moment. I think I've come to accept that that's okay. And so I will end with words by someone much more profound than me to say that, you know, the established disorder is not necessary and another world is not only needed, it's possible, but not if we are to be ensorcelled in the despair, cynicism or optimism and the belief or disbelief discourse of progress. So with that, thanks very much.
Thank you, Karina. That was great. And it was really intrigued by your discussion of the sort of politics of knowledge production. I think that's really important, and acknowledging the processes of how the report came about, and the kinds of places and people that are in it. And certainly, I'm very much in agreement about the emergency, the problematic nature of emergency thinking. We've certainly seen that in responses to the illegal wildlife trade. The sense of emergency has allowed all sorts of new, much more forceful and violent policies to be enacted and justified. So we'll pass now on to our second speaker, Mathew Mabele, who will be talking to us about what's a desirable conservation future. So it ties in really nicely to the talk that Karina just gave us. So Mathew, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rosaleen, for this great opportunity to be part of this panel to talk about conservation futures. And so what I'm going to talk about comes from several discussions that we have been having here in Tanzania, and specifically through the Conviva project. So it's a sort of a collaborative thinking behind what I'm going to talk about. And this is, it includes William Kiwango, who is a member of Conviva project in Tanzania. Yeah, so when Rosaleen invited me to this panel, she asked me to talk about, some of the activities that I've been doing through the Conviva project. And then we thought that we could share, these activities in this conference. But before I go to talk about what we've been doing as Conviva project, I thought I should begin by sort of providing sort of a background to why we are thinking about a desirable conservation future. So I just begin by talking about the state of conservation in Tanzania, and going back to some of the seminal writings in political ecology. As you might be aware that Tanzania is one of the hotspots when it comes to political ecology research. So there have been several seminal readings that have come out of Tanzania documenting the state of conservation. So I just mentioned a few, the like of Dan Brockington, Christine Noor, Lodrick Newman. There are many other political ecology scholars who have researched in Tanzania to demonstrate, the problematic nature of conservation in Tanzania. So in Tanzania, as one of the leading countries in the world when it comes to conservation, has been quite much shaped by the problematic philosophy of the so-called protected areas. And this also comes from yesterday's talk. Currently, the data that we have in Tanzania, it shows that almost 40% of the land is under some sort of conservation through protected areas, and this has been this started during the colonial times, but it has also been increasing even at the time of post-colonial period. But over the last 30 years, Tanzania has also been one of the pioneers for the so-called community-based natural resource management. And this we have experienced this through different forms in the forestry sector, but also in the wildlife sector, in the marine and coastal resources sector. So the idea behind community-based natural resource management was that people should be involved, and we should move away from the so-called fortress conservation, which Brockington has documented in the past. But again, political ecology studies have shown problematic practices behind this community-based natural resource management. So it has not been pretty much successful when it comes to issues of governance and issues of improvement of livelihoods. And this, one of the reasons to why this happened is because of the philosophy behind protected areas, which is pretty much grounded on the idea of separating people from nature. So so pretty much conservation science, policy and practice in Tanzania is quite grounded on these colonial assumptions and principles, which impact this idea of separating people from nature. And these assumptions and principles ignore the local histories, but also ignore the social ecologies. And as a result of that, conservation has been producing substantive injustices, because the policy and practices pretty much restrict some of the livelihood strategies that local people, such as farmers and herders, have historically been experiencing. So the policies and practices pretty much restrict livestock grazing, charcoal making, and shifting cultivation, and because they label these practices as disturbances to the natural processes. So, but also such policies and practices, but also they have also facilitated recurring human-wildlife conflicts, as we have heard from yesterday's talk. So what I would say with the state of conservation in Tanzania is that colonial legacies are still pretty much implanted in conservation in Tanzania. So how do we move from that? And also from yesterday's talk, there was a question that was raised, in terms of how to address the legacies of colonial ecology in countries such as Tanzania. And I would reflect on that question through one of the very key, or one of the very important readings that have just come out in this year from the Ugandan scholar called Sylvia Tamale, with a book titled Decolonization and Afrofeminism. So in the book, Tamale tries to argue about how to engage with the decolonial reconstruction of African politics, but also African lives. Although she argued that undoing the legacies of coloniality and the colonialism is not an easy task. It's a very complex task that require creative approaches that would take long time to be effective. And this is because we are still, we are still witnessing the legacies of colonization in our everyday life. For the just few examples that I've just said in terms of policies that restrict livestock grazing, policies that restrict charcoal making, but also policies that restrict shifting cultivation. These are everyday lives of many Tanzanians who are living nearby the so-called protected areas. But however, there are scholars who have thought about potential approaches. And one of the approaches that have just came out last year and this year is the so-called convivial conservation. Brian Busher and Robert Fletcher wrote a book where they argue for the conservation revolution. And so this idea of conservation revolution actually fits better with the ongoing discussion about the need to decolonize conservation science, policy, and practice in Southern Africa, in Tanzania in particular. So it fits best with this idea of the colonial thinking. And because their proposal actually also talks about the need to disrupt and dismantle the coloniality of knowledge, which is pretty much still persisting in biodiversity conservation across Southern Africa. So with their convivial conservation, Bram and Rob, they have suggested some elements which, or they have provided some sort of a vision on how to have convivial conservation. And I would just like to talk about two visions which I think relate to our project in Tanzania. And one of the visions that I've just suggested is to have the so-called promoted areas. So they are trying to think beyond the so-called protected areas. Because with protected areas, it pretty much, as I've said, separate people from nature. But with promoted area, it tries to have people as visitors, but also as dwellers amongst these conservation areas. And this actually aligns with a Southern Africa philosophy called Ubuntu. I talked about it yesterday, but I could just sum up on what it means. So Ubuntu is a Southern Africa philosophy and moral theory which tries to provide a sort of a code of conduct amongst people on how people are supposed to relate to other people, but also on how people are supposed to relate to non-human species. So it's so it talks about having sort of a harmony relationship amongst people, but also between humans and non-humans. So it fits much better with this idea of having promoted areas. And actually, even Tamale in her book also, when thinking about the colonial reconstruction, she also argues about the need to embrace this idea of Ubuntu, because it's a pretty much relevant philosophy and moral theory across Southern Africa, especially amongst the Bantu-speaking group. But also, Bram and Rob talks about the need to think about alternative funding mechanisms. They need to move away from capitalistic financial structures that have been pretty much problematic, because actually they are pretty much behind some of the environmental development problems, such as the biodiversity loss, but also some of the species extinction that have been raised by people behind interventions such as the Half Earth Project, but also the 30 by 30 campaign. Yeah, so in terms of alternative funding mechanisms, and this is also essential in the context of Tanzania, especially now with the ongoing austerity measures that we are experiencing in Tanzania. And this, William mentioned it yesterday. So now with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, but also before that, there was sort of a change of policy in terms of revenue collection. So in the past, conservation agencies in Tanzania and the authorities had the mandate to collect revenue. So they had the mandate to collect revenue and how to think about how to spend it, for conservation. But now all revenues are being collected by a centralized agency, which is a state national revenue authority. So when it collects the revenue from the conservation areas, it goes to the state fund, and then the state is the one who going to decide about where to spend the money. So that has been pretty much problematic because with having issues of poor social services such as education, health systems. So it's quite obvious that the state won't send money to conservation. It has to send money to build schools, to create better hospitals and stuff like that. So that has been pretty much problematic in Tanzania. And that's why you also pretty much like the idea of thinking about alternative funding mechanism under these conditions. And one of the mechanisms that we are thinking in Tanzania is the so-called community conservation insurance schemes. So there are several lessons that we can learn from Tanzania, because we have had the so-called community insurance schemes through community health fund. So it's pretty much something that can take place in Tanzania, but that is something that we are still thinking about how to develop it further. So that is one of the ways how to address the legacies of colonial ecology in Tanzania and in Southern Africa in particular through this convivial conservation. But the other way that we have been thinking about in our project is through diversification of knowledge systems. Because as I've said, currently conservation science is pretty much informed by colonial assumptions and principles, which are pretty much not relevant to the context and the histories and social ecologies in Tanzania. So one of the ways to move out of such a legacy is to have diversified knowledge systems. And you have plenty of wealth of indigenous knowledge systems that have not been sufficiently kept. That is what we are trying to do in this project, to try to understand such indigenous knowledge systems and how they can they can produce, or they can bring better thinking that could inform conservation that is socially just. But also the need to diversify knowledge system comes because we need to also to disrupt and dismantle this ideology of differences, that were implanted by these colonial assumptions and principles, because, and one of the very relevant examples in terms of how conservation still labels livelihood practices such as shifting cultivation as problematic, it still labels them as being disturbances to natural processes. So we need to move out of such labeling and such thinking, and we think that through diversification of knowledge systems and consideration of these indigenous systems could also be one of the ways. But also this could also be achieved through a new curriculum and new training programs in ecology, because we think that could also be a very key vehicle towards diversifying knowledge system that inform conservation science policy and practice in Tanzania. So there's a need to decenter away from the Western prioritization of our African environments, but also even sometimes of African ways of living. So that is just a sum up to what I've just said. So to conclude, like to go back again to reflect on the question that I have in the slide, in the titles, the slide of the title of this talk. What is the desirable conservation future then? Coming from what I've just said, but also from Karina's talk and yesterday's talk in our convivial conservation session. So I think, firstly, I would argue that a conservation that restores the dignity of African farmers and herders, that is what we desire, because as I've said, it has been pretty much problematic, because conservation currently has been pretty much problematizing African farmers and herders as being destructive to nature. So we need to have a conservation that restores the dignity of African farmers and herders. And this could be achieved, of course, through the colonial reconstruction of conservation science and policy. So we need to have conservation that acknowledges people's presence, conservation that acknowledges people's ambition, interest, and priorities, as it has been doing for ecological integrity. And secondly, I would argue that a desirable conservation future is the one that doesn't entirely depend on unstable and problematic capitalistic market and finance mechanisms. Because as we have experienced with the COVID-19, but also as we have experienced in the past with the so-called REDD+ policy mechanism, such unstable and problematic capitalistic institutions and mechanisms have pretty much produced which some scholars, such as some scholars have called an economy of expectations, because it has created a false economy of expectation. And this has been very much problematic because it has brought a lot of resentment and frustrations amongst people, because they thought that these capitalistic financial institutions are going to bring money and they are going to improve our lives, but that has actually not been the case. So we need to move out of this, out of such structures. So a desirable conservation future is the one that could try to find alternative financial mechanisms that are not tied to such structures. And lastly, I would argue that a conservation future that is pretty much informed by diversified knowledge systems that move away from the colonial implanted ideologies and philosophies of difference when it comes to describing the human-environmental interaction in Tanzania, but more broadly in Southern Africa. So I would just sum up that we need a conservation future that involves the colonial reconstruction of philosophies and the ideologies that inform the human-environment interactions, but also conservation future that involve the construction of both conservation finance, but also in conservation knowledge. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mathew. Again, another fantastic talk there, and I really like the connections you made between decolonising knowledge and also moving away from systems that rely on capitalist forms of finance for conservation, which we've seen are very deeply problematic. So we'll now move on to our third talk, which is Hannah Dickinson, who'll be talking about conservation futures and the policies of the European Union. So Hannah, do you want to go ahead?
Right. So thank you everyone for joining this morning, and thank you Rosaleen and George for organising this session. I'm going to talk about the geopolitical ecologies of EU biodiversity conservation strategies, and in particular I'm going to look at Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 and the future plans that it outlines for conservation in the EU and also beyond the EU. So in terms of a little bit of background of where I'm coming from with this, I've recently completed my PhD with the Biosec project, and my PhD examined the process of regulating against illegal caviar trade in the EU, and I looked at this from a geopolitical ecology perspective and analysed the kind of unintended consequences that emerged from regulating caviar trade in Europe. And through this work, I became increasingly interested in analysing the intersections of geopolitics and biodiversity conservation in the EU more broadly. And so my interests theoretically build on work in the emerging field of geopolitical ecology, which brings together ideas and insights from critical geopolitics with political ecology. And in doing so, this allows us to examine, in the words of Patrick Vigor, how large geopolitical institutions define, control and manage nature in the EU. And also building on some more recent work from Francis Massey and Jared Margulies to consider how geopolitics works through conservation. So specifically today, I'm going to examine how geopolitics works through the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which was published in May 2020. And this strategy has lots that includes lots to be pleased about. It's an authoritative roadmap for the way in which the EU plans to protect and restore nature over the next decade. And it's far-reaching in scope, aims and ambitions. It covers a really diverse range of issues, including protected areas, legal frameworks, agriculture and food security, soil, forests, energy production, marine and freshwater ecosystems, urban natures, pollution and invasive alien species. So it is really broad and ambitious in its aims. And today I'll ground my discussion in my expertise in wildlife trade and also protected areas. But I want to start with emphasising my major point, and that's that we need to consider the way in which the EU's biodiversity strategy for 2030 has underlying geopolitical motivation and ecological implications for the future. So today I'm going to focus on three aspects of the biodiversity strategy from a geopolitical ecology perspective, and political and economic narratives underlying the biodiversity strategy. The second is analysing the implications that the strategy has for geopolitical relations between EU member states. And the third is examining the geopolitical implications of the EU's biodiversity strategy more broadly in a global sense and beyond the EU. And so first, I want to look at the political economic narratives underpinning the strategy. In 2003, Noel Castry said that how environmental problems are represented. And that's very true in the way in which the environmental problems are represented in the EU biodiversity strategy, and also in the way in the particular aim forward for how to deal with it. And so I've been thinking in line with Shannon O'Lear and her book Environmental Geopolitics that was published in 2018. And Shannon stresses the need to examine how the environment is brought into narratives, practices and physical realities of power and place. So I've been thinking this through in relation to the narratives underpinning the biodiversity strategy. And the biodiversity strategy is fundamentally built on a number of neoliberal narratives that set the direction for EU biodiversity conservation in potentially troubling ways. And so the strategy around the main narrative to bring nature back into our lives. And unpacking this narrative, the way in which bringing nature back into our lives is in kind of a very utilitarian and neoliberal economic sense. So the strategy really emphasises using nature to aid economic recovery from COVID, for pursuing sustainable growth, pursuing economic prosperity, ensuring the productivity of natural capital, creating jobs, and all of these ideas are framed in terms of the European Green Deal. So on the surface, this is commendable and not so problematic, but the issues around it is that it's human-centric. It centres the economy and human needs and continues to be very growth-oriented without considering the intrinsic benefits for biodiversity. So actually biodiversity is really placed secondary in the plan. Furthermore, the strategy is also presented as ambitious and transformative in the EU's own words, but the narratives around restarting the economy and pursuing economic growth actually seem far from radical and maybe appear as kind of a greenwashed business as usual. So, and I've also got concerns about this ongoing business as usual, and that's also rooted in what the EU emits from the strategy. And so the strategy identifies that the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss are land and sea use changes, overexploitation of resource organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. But what's missing is that there's no reference to what the underlying driver of all of these forms of biodiversity loss are. And so there's no reference to capitalism, and in particular to unsustainable production and consumption patterns as underpinning these 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. So my concern for biodiversity is that if the EU can't explicitly confront the realities of unsustainable production and consumption in the strategy, then clearly the biodiversity strategy isn't designed to dismantle or radically alter the workings of these economic systems. So the future conservation plan embedded in some semblance of a neoliberal business as usual. And what's even more troubling is that the strategy presents an undifferentiated view of responsibility for biodiversity loss. It's presented as a collective, as a whole society approach, including from the lowest scale of individuals all the way up through corporations to government. But the environmentally destructive corporations and industry in biodiversity loss. And I'm going to take a direct quote from the strategy now, which says, industry and business an impact on nature. The strategy doesn't go as far to say whether it's positive or detrimental. It doesn't recognise that not all industries and businesses have the same impact. So this begs the question, who's, by these kind of half-hearted narratives around business and industry, whose interests are being protected and at what costs for humans and non-human life. Also, this kind of Karina's point around emergency narratives and crisis narratives, and that is something that is presented in the EU biodiversity strategy, and the word urgent is used a lot. But if things really are as urgent as presented, then where are the radical economic alternatives to neoliberalism? Where's the critique of production and consumption? And where are the critiques of industrial scale meat and dairy production? Where are degrowth ideas? All of these are missing from the main political economic narratives of the biodiversity strategy. And so my is that these narratives, these kind of neoliberal narratives around sustainable growth, will be integrated into future conservation practices and the fear of power and place in the EU and beyond. And it's worth considering where the power will remain and whose hands the power will remain in EU's biodiversity plan as it's set out. My concern is that it's going to remain with the corporations. And really, can growth be sustainable if we aren't confronting the root cause of biodiversity loss, which is unfettered production and consumption in the EU? And so now I'm going to move to my next slide, which is around the geopolitical ecologies of plans for future protected areas in the EU. So the biodiversity strategy sets out a major target to enlarge the number and scale of areas in the EU and to protect 30% of land and 30% of sea by 2030, and to create a coherent trans-European nature network. That in designating new protected areas or expanding existing ones, there should be a specific focus on areas of very high biodiversity value or potential, and in particular on protecting the marine and terrestrial ecosystems in the EU's outermost regions due to their exceptionally high biodiversity value. Now, the explicitly state where, but I think it's fair to assume that these locations will probably be Greece, Italy, Portugal, Romania. So the target's got distinct geopolitical implications for relations between EU member states and for the designation of responsibility for protecting biodiversity. States, and this is a quote, that every member state will have to do its fair share of the effort based upon objective ecological criteria, recognising that each country has a different quantity and quality of biodiversity. And so this aim kind of raises some troubling questions for me. What are these objective ecological criteria? They're not described in the biodiversity strategy. So who decides them? Criteria ever really be objective? And it also begs a broader question of should designating an objective process? Designation of protected areas in the EU only on ecological criteria overlooks a number of important socio-political and economic factors which should be integrated into decision making and make this process more subjective, arguably more fair when deciding what's a fair share of responsibility. Yes, not only do each EU member states have a different quantity and quality of biodiversity, but they've also got different current and historical levels of ecologically consumption. And so I'm concerned that only taking ecological factors into account when designating protected areas in the EU actually suggests that EU member states are quite homogenous in terms of economically, culturally, politically and socially, but that's fundamentally just not the case. So focusing on in the outermost reaches of Europe on member states with lower states that are also more acutely ecological issues such as deforestation and arguably other external geopolitical issues such as the climate crisis. And so these compounding factors mean that the singular time frame that the EU proposes for all EU members significant progress on meeting these targets, which is actually only by 2023, so it's a very short time frame really, might be just. And my worry is that focusing on these particular ecosystems of the objectives for mainland European countries in contributing to targets, areas in Europe is undeniably a geo. It's not just, and protected areas, I argue, can't be extricated from the wider economic context, even if considers that. And so to achieve the aim of creating a trans-European nature network in the connected ecological corridors in Europe, the foreground collaboration and cooperation between EU member states, and be specific about how this can be achieved. Because currently it's really unhelpful to individualise the process and responsibility for designating new protected areas, particularly in around this flawed notion of fair share that's only based on ecological factors alone. And I think that pursuing it in this manner could entrench existing inequalities between EU member states by placing a burden upon a small number of member states to create areas without addressing the big elephant in the room, which is the underlying issue of unequal capitalist production and consumption between member states. Finally, I just want to discuss the geopolitical, in terms of the geopolitical ecologies of EU conservation futures, I want to think about the global geopolitical implications of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And so this discussion brings the notion of geopolitics acting through conservation to the fore. The Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 outlines the EU's intention to lead all efforts on global biodiversity conservation. So the plan sets out the EU's green diplomacy, trade and development arrangements, and to set biodiversity protection and sustainable growth. And so in this sense, the biodiversity strategy sets out an ambitious vision for EU external action, which has distinct geopolitical motives and implications. The EU's interests in green diplomacy are not new. They were first outlined back in 2003, and there's been a subsequent an EU green diplomacy network. But the strategy for 2030 really re-emphasises and ramps up these plans to establish green alliances with third countries. Unfortunately, the strategy is not very specific on what green alliances mean in practice, beyond stating the aim to rally the world to EU positions on protection of the environment and sustainable development. The strategy aims for external conservation action in the language of cooperation and collaboration, but this language of reciprocity seems to be at odds with the overriding sets out to be the global leader in biodiversity conservation efforts. So there's a need to how the EU is going to use this biodiversity strategy in the future as a way of extending its soft power into other countries and regions, and to think about how the EU is set to gain from this. Because despite the references to inclusivity, there's a need to examine the uneven power relations that are embedded in the external facing aspects of the EU biodiversity strategy. For example, there's some problematic neo-colonial implications outline plans to cooperate in undifferentiated Africa. And in reality, this cooperation looks less about integrated conservation approaches and ideas, and more about bringing the rest of the world in line with the EU position. And it's unclear in the plan what that means in practice and what form these green alliances will take, but from what's set out, it's quite. And also the strategy supposedly has a commitment to integrating Indigenous peoples and Indigenous thought systems, but again outlined how that will happen in practice. And in particular, it's concerning because the emphasis is placed on aligning with the neoliberal EU diversity presents, and so it's hard to kind of reconcile these different thought systems. And finally, I want to ground this discussion around the power relations of the EU's external vision for biodiversity. Look at it through the plans that it outlines to tackle illegal wildlife trade. Interestingly, illegal wildlife trade is only mentioned in to the EU's external conservation plans. It's not mentioned at all in terms of protecting and restoring EU biodiversity. And in the biodiversity strategy, it's a very narrow focus on tightening the rules of ivory trade. So this draws disproportionate attention to enforcement issues in source countries and promotes EU into African countries in particular. And it also sets the tone that the EU overwhelmingly sees and will respond to illegal wildlife trade in reductive terms as a problem with African countries as the source and Asian countries as consumers. And this feeds into problematic and racialised ideas about Asian super consumers, which has been critiqued by Jared Morgan and Rosaleen Duffy in a recent Geoforum article. And so this carries with it particular geopolitical implications about future directions for EU wildlife trade, and it also obscures the EU's position as a source and consumer of wildlife products, in particular such as European eel, sturgeon and songbirds. And so to sum up, Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 is in many ways a really welcome move towards centering biodiversity conservation in the EU's future policy directions, and there's lots, and the EU should be commended for how they're seeking to bring nature back into our lives through a really strategy. But the plans outlined in the strategy are rooted in neoliberal and greenwash business as usual narratives focused on pursuing growth and restarting the economy. So despite the claims that the strategy is ambitious and transformative, it lacks any kind of radical thinking or alternative conservation, such as degrowth. And with reports from the UN showing that globally we've not met any biodiversity targets over the last 2 decades, the business as usual approach promoted by the EU for the next decade is likely to result in biodiversity outcomes.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. It was a really interesting talk about the sort of EU biodiversity strategy and how it links in again with capitalist logics and the sort of omissions within the strategy, and also kind of placing that kind of collective responsibility on everybody in an undifferentiated way, so that we see these kinds of business as usual models. So it tied in really nicely with Mathew and Karina's talks as well. Thank you so much. And now our final speaker, Giorgio Dikescu, who is standing in for Anne Vu. For those of you who didn't see right at the beginning, unfortunately Anne can't join us because she's had to travel as a result of the hostile environment here in the UK for international workers. So I'm very grateful to George for stepping in right at the last minute, but I'm sure that he'll provide us with a very fascinating take on the ideas of wilderness in Europe. So George, go ahead.
Good morning or good evening for our colleagues that joined from other parts of the world. Thank you so much, Rosaleen, for giving me the floor. I regret that Anne could not make it for this talk. I'm sure everyone was waiting for her exciting discussion on demand reduction campaigns. But I will try to tie in with some of the discussions that have been going on so far in this panel, and I will remain with a focus on EU policy framework for environmental protection. And I've provocatively entitled my talk, "The Trouble with the EU Wilderness Future." Those who have been following the recent debates about biodiversity conservation and habitat protection in the European Union might have noticed that these favor a turn towards strict protection, wilderness, and untouched nature narratives. I think that this should be raising serious concerns about the social and environmental justice on the continent. Over the last decades, various MAPs and officials from the European Commission have worked together to advance the protection of wilderness in the Union. They issued soft laws, such as guidelines for Natura 2000 protected areas and a dedicated resolution. In parallel, prominent environmental NGOs initiated concrete actions to identify the last areas of, quote, unspoiled nature, to lobby for their strict protection as part of domestic legislation, and to turn wilderness conservation into a profitable business through its commodification within ecotourism operation, but also as part of climate change mitigation strategies. This new re-evaluation of old-growth forest and other intact landscapes have made particular regions on the continent a prime focus for new financial mechanisms for carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation strategies, and new economic growth models that Hannah was previously talking about. As civic campaigns and high-end political negotiations around wilderness protection turn the issue into a recurrent topic on the public agenda, the geopolitical nature of this conservation approach becomes more critical in defining and redefining the ways borders and peripheries are understood and acted upon in the EU. Although very heterogeneous, wilderness projects and supporting initiatives share a few standard features. They come as a response to degradation narratives of land abandonment, and they propose wilderness conservation as a way to fix these problems. They also present a strict protection approach opposed to an allegedly failing marginal and subsistence agriculture in many regions. And they legitimate the interventions by appealing to Western scientific knowledge. And lastly, they glorify past ecological reaches that most of the Western Europe has lost, augmenting thus the urgency to act. Emerging as private projects, these wilderness-related enterprises have been championed by state and regional authorities throughout the entire continent. And now, as the new Common Agricultural Policy and the European New Green Deal are implemented, conservationists suggest that wilderness and conserving untouched nature will mark a new era in intergovernmental cooperation, and will conclude with the introduction of wilderness values in sectors such as agriculture, energy, and infrastructural development. But you may ask yourself, how did we get here? And what is the institutional history of wilderness in the European Union? I will not go through all this history, but I will just mark a couple of few moments that are important. For example, intensely lobbied for by a coalition of environmental NGOs, scientists, and philanthropists, Wilderness debuted on the European political scene with the adoption of a resolution by the European Parliament in 2009. Of course, resolutions are not binding, but this document called on the Commission to give a spatial status and a stricter protection for wilderness zones in the Natura 2000 network. This is a network established by the Habitats and the Birds Directive all over the European Union. 10 years after, the strict protection of undisturbed nature is considered now the most radical conservation approach that the EU can offer and can export or re-export. This year, in May, the European Commission launched a new biodiversity strategy for 2030, and the targets for 2030 horizon include an increase in EU's protected areas to 30% of the continent's land mass and seas, and 10% of strict protection areas. Without offering any further details on the social and economic impacts on this proposal, there are high chances that new waves of dispossession will be among the unexpected consequences of reaching this target. The strategy proposes, I quote, that there should be a specific focus on areas of very high biodiversity value or potential. Where and how will such strictly protected areas will be distributed? And if you remember, we find similar targets in the Zero draft of Global Biodiversity Framework to be adopted by the CBD Secretariat later this year or maybe next year. And according to this document, by 2030, the parties aim to protect and conserve through well-connected and effective system of protected areas at least 30% of the planet, with the focus on areas particularly important for biodiversity. I'm sure these areas will not be in the outskirts of London or Paris or Zurich, maybe Zurich. Wilderness as a concept of concern for environmental law and policy making in the EU is very young. The current wilderness momentum needs to be historicized and investigated against contemporary global conservation debates. And I think that the local, historical, and socio-political context makes European wilderness protection significantly different to other similar movements, although in my opinion, it is still a reiteration of half-earth proposals. But far from adopting a globalized Yellowstone fortress type of narrative, the European actors propose many interpretations of wilderness, each with profound political and social implications. While public attitudes to wilderness vary over the continent, most of the recent legal developments champion a strict separation of wild nature from human history and use. For example, the European Commission made public a set of guidelines for wilderness in 2013, and this document stresses the idea that those areas with potential wilderness qualities have developed historically and ecologically without human management, independent from traditional land use practices. This was a quote from the document. Read as part of a global attempt to strictly secure large areas of land for nature to develop according to its own rules, the European wilderness momentum appears as a process of re-territorialization, in my opinion, on one hand, and as the creation of a new resource, on the other hand. This new resource has become of utmost importance among EU strategies for green growth and climate change mitigation, and the making and maintenance of this resource have involved the establishment of strict boundaries between domesticated nature and areas in which mostly white male scientists and conservationists discovered an autonomous nature that has evolved independently of any human influence. Although merely a decade old, such conservation approaches have triggered important changes in socio-environmental relations. During my doctoral research, I discovered that these wilderness protection projects have predominantly targeted the outer regions of the EU, created an imagined green periphery, and as I was focusing on these processes in Eastern Europe, I proposed to call this green internal periphery the new Wild East. As it reads from the West, this wilderness frontier was revealed and discovered after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Since the wild nature of Eastern Europe and the wilderness in the periphery has been discovered, threatening degradation narratives have proliferated. Overgrazing, intensive use, deforestation, overhunting, highway and infrastructural developments are all elements of a sudden attack on Europe's less wild areas according to the official narratives. As intact landscapes and old-growth forests are strictly protected wildlands and are considered as part of European New Green Deal, I see the development of this wilderness protection in the region as a process of unequal ecological exchange between a wealthier Western core, where decision-making processes, hegemonic conservation knowledge, and financial mechanisms are concentrated and deployed, therefore, to fix, to restore, reconstruct and to sustainably use nature discovered in a periphery. This periphery is characterized by backwardness, subsistence, land abandonment, and depopulation. What binds together these wilderness conservation projects are not only the strong political and ideological support, but also the similar socio-economic local context that enable them. Local conditions such as declining rural population, actual or relative land abandonment, the demise of traditional land use practices, and cheap nature are all features of this new green internal periphery. To conclude, I think that this is about time to ask ourselves, why is European environmental policy turning to wilderness protection when strict conservation has failed elsewhere? Where will the policymaker find these untouched areas? We remember up to 10% of the continent, and who will pay for their protection? And lastly, who will be the winners and who will be the losers of this wilderness future that European policymaking holds for us? Thank you so much for the attention.
Thank you, George. And again, that was a really interesting intersection with the other three talks. And I really appreciated the sort of your analysis of what constitutes the periphery as well, and the sort of the role of the white male scientists in defining landscapes and how they can be used. So, but now I can see that there are lots of questions in the chat, and I'll hand over to Amber, who has been monitoring the questions in the chat box.
Yes, thank you. We've got a lot of questions have come through. Since George just got finished with his presentation, I think we'll start with the most recent one, as it's a bit of a clarification. Could George talk about the rewilding movement a little bit? The questioner is interested in that he doesn't use the term and wonder if and how he thinks it overlaps with the wilderness movement.
Thank you so much, Jeannie Thomas, for your question. I spotted it while I was finishing my presentation. Intentionally, I avoided at any cost the term rewilding because it's very, very contentious. Generally, rewilding is a process of reaching different types of wilderness. Of course, all over Europe, it's not necessarily a coherent process. We find great differences from rewilding in Britain, for example, to rewilding in other regions of Europe. The hegemonic discourse on rewilding in Europe is held by the Rewilding Europe organization based in the Netherlands, and they are also the most influential across the continent. They have 7 or 8 rewilding projects ongoing. If you check the distribution on the map, you will see them distributed on the peripheries, from the Arctic to Eastern Europe, where they have 4 projects, to the Iberian Peninsula and other peripheries of the EU or internal peripheries. So you will see that these dynamics might be in place there as well. One feature of rewilding, as it is promoted by Rewilding Europe currently, is that they mostly develop their projects in areas where land has been abandoned. Of course, this process is not politicized, or it's not considered in their socio-economic background, but it's just considered an ecological process. It just happened. So mostly they try to undo this harm of land abandonment by introducing some species, usually grazing species like the European bison and so on, to produce mosaic landscapes and rewild the ecosystem. The issue of baseline in this story is very contentious, and you will not see the same baseline from one project to another, and it's highly contestable by science. But there has been important literature on rewilding done by political ecologists, Mihnea Tănăsescu, for example, Monica Vasile. So I recommend to go and check their work because they are more authoritative to talk about this. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Here's a question for Karina and Mathew in particular. The questioner says, thanks for 2 brilliant talks. It often seems as though approaches like convivial conservation suggest that moving beyond mainstream conservation and the capitalist political economy will lead to outcomes that are more socially just, better long-term wildlife conservation, and climatically desirable futures. Does this not clash with the message from Biodiversity Revisited in which the three outcomes are alternative futures amongst which one must be prioritized, rather than a win-win-win scenario? And actually, this is probably a question for all of our panelists. Matthew, would you like to respond?
You want to go first?
Okay, you can go, Karina. You can go first.
Me? Yeah. Look, I think it's really difficult to answer that question in the abstract. And I think that this, I do think that the win-win rhetoric is a problem. You know, I think that lots of work has shown from both a social or a ecological perspective that the attempts to balance conservation and development, while there's some successes, often fail at both, or don't fail is, I mean, what is failure? There's a question in the chat box about failure that I think is great as well. But so I do think that one of the things that sort of as a kind of community and as a movement we need to get better at dealing with is trade-offs, and how to navigate and negotiate trade-offs in ways that are just and equitable. One of the things that sort of, I don't know if I can't remember, you know, once you give a talk you always forget what you said, but I'm pretty sure that I left out the sort of one of the key points that I wanted to make around when we're thinking about which monsters we love or don't love. It needs to be, I hold on to the notion of justice and equity being a really important part of that conversation. And I fear that much of the win-win rhetoric kind of diverts us into a conversation or an approach that fails to recognise that there will be winners and losers, and that perhaps a more equitable way of dealing with that dynamic of winners and losers is to look at what types of decision-making processes, what types of compensatory processes, whatever it is, might need to be put in place to help find better solutions. But I think that is a conversation that needs to happen in a particular place, in a particular context, with the people who are going to be impacted by it.
Yeah, so I think it's the question came from Rogelio. It's a very good question, and as Karina said, it's a good and difficult question. But I think for my reading of this concept of biodiversity revisited, and also from my engagement with the idea behind convivial conservation, I think they both stress on the need for more diverse and just approaches to biodiversity conservation. So that is the key similarity that is there between the two. But I think key difference, which I would think that, which I think makes, I might be biased, but which I think makes convivial conservation more appealing towards creating a socially just conservation, is in terms of how convivial conservation interrogates these underlying structures and processes that have been behind our environmental development programs. So I think that is one of the very key difference that has convivial conservation has with Biodiversity Revisited, in terms of trying to understand the root causes behind the ongoing biodiversity loss. And also, it's also in terms of the kind of radical means that convivial conservation provides on how to attain and achieve a socially just conservation. So in terms of the thinking behind, the need to move away from the dichotomy between separating nature from people, but also we need to think about how to have the colonial reconstruction of science and philosophies behind conservation and policy and practice. So I think those two, but also the thinking about trying to find alternative funding mechanisms. So I think this these elements somehow make convivial conservation a bit different from the Biodiversity Revisited agenda. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so here's the next question. And this is, I think, for everyone. It seems that you all agree that fair and creative conservation futures will require collaborations at all scales, but also attention to power asymmetries in those collaborative processes. In particular, what theories can help us here? What do you draw on? What do you think about revisiting negotiation theories or any other ideas?
Amber, can I, as chair, jump in to say something in response? I think that's a really great question. And I think, I mean, the obvious thing to say in a POLLEN conference is we can draw on political ecology, which is great. And it's really, I think it's really good at these kinds of questions and certainly at drawing out power asymmetries. Personally, I think to date, I think the sort of literature on governance mechanisms and the sort of international scale type work on negotiations has not been as good at addressing these sort of questions of historical injustices, the ongoing dynamics and consequences of colonialism. I don't think that it's been very good at dealing with the questions of the non-human until very recently. And I think that's one of the areas that I want to really develop over the next few years, is that how do we put together approaches from political ecology with approaches from multi-species justice and from animal studies, and also from kind of literature, philosophy and political theory, because I think we can be drawing on those much more fully. But that, again, you know, all of those traditions and canons of work also need to be looked at through the lens of needing to decolonise our knowledge base as well. And so I think there are lots of different things that we can draw on, but I think many of our academic disciplines as singular disciplines are not well equipped to deal with these questions at all. But I think political ecology is rather better placed than many. But I'll hand over to the panellists now.
I could add something on that, and while doing it, give my little rebuff to that Biodiversity Revisited did hope to address a bunch of the things that Mathew just said it didn't. It was a large and complex beast, and the research agenda that we developed tackled a lot of the issues that you raised. So I'll save myself getting beat over the head by my colleagues in that little bit. But I think Rosaleen's answer was entirely correct. One of the other things that I would throw into that mix is science and technology studies, and the way in which it sort of has an explicit focus on drawing attention to the knowledge power dynamics and the kinds of things that Mathew talked about around diversifying knowledge systems and decolonising the ways in which we think about power and injustice. And I would add also to that from I think for a political ecology audience, talking about science is political, biodiversity futures are political, justice matters, you know, this is just the bread and butter of political ecology. I spend a lot of my time more within a conservation world, and I'm telling you, those conversations are difficult. Well, not difficult, but they're being much more accepted now than they were even just 10 years ago, you know. I mean, and one of the things that I think is novel's such a loaded word, but one of the things that the Biodiversity Revisited initiative really tried to do in speaking to that biodiversity audience as opposed to the political ecology audience was to bring that thinking in and to say, actually, biodiversity and justice have to be put on equal footing. And once you start to bring justice into the way in which you understand and interrogate collaborations and conservation, whether it's past, present or future, you can't help but look at power and power asymmetries and power inequalities, both in the way in which conservation projects are put in place, but also the way that conservation priorities are determined by science. And there's lots of comments in the questions around the dominance of white kind of northern science in shaping conservation priorities. And like 100%, that's why science and technology studies, which puts that focus on the knowledge power dynamic, I think is really important.
All right, so there's a question here specifically directed at Hannah and or George. Both of you expressed some concern about a generally unequal power dynamic between a Western core and an Eastern periphery within the EU. An outcome that is a possibility that certain member states would be disproportionately burdened with the responsibility of achieving the EU's biodiversity objectives as per the Biodiversity Strategy. This seems like a reflection of what happens more generally at a global scale, Buscher's inverted commons. Do you think that at a European scale, there's any scope for those unfairly burdened member states to challenge this dynamic? Even if they could, would they? And or would they want to challenge the neoliberal apologist / capitalist logic / greenwash narratives that run through the biodiversity strategy? It's a bit of a complex question, but let me know if you need reminding of different parts of it. It's a multi-part.
Do you want to go first, Hannah, or should I go first?
I'll say what I've got to say, and then I feel like we can some ideas off each other in answering this question, because yeah, it's a big one. My initial thought is that I guess some EU member states are in a sense challenging this dynamic by not actually prescribing or abiding to the regulations that the EU sets down. That makes me think the issue around timber trade in Romania, but also around conservation in Romania. And there's a lot of cases or examples where the Romanian state are not implementing necessarily the regulations that have been imposed by the EU. And obviously the EU have then set up this sanction process against Romania in relation to their timber. So I don't know whether it's worth conceptualizing these derogations or choices to not implement EU law as a way of contesting the power dynamic, the ideas that trying to make the member states subscribe to. I don't know. What do you think, George?
I think that's a very, very important point. And when trying to answer this question, we have to remember the political process at the EU level. And the European Commission is not the most democratic body that the EU has. The Parliament is unable to push for policy most often, and it doesn't have these attributions. So member states usually do not necessarily have a say in these strategies or in some resolutions of the Euro Parliament, which are anyways inefficient and not binding. And even if we look at the member state tier, at the member state level, we'll see that it's not that clear how the camps oppose themselves. You may see that the states promote this kind of policies, but then at the regional level or at the local level where the impact is felt hardest, they have other opinions and they have other means to opposing this kind of proposals. And I will give you the example of Romania again, because it's the one that I know best. Romania prides itself within the EU as the green heart of Europe, the Carpathian Garden, and our touristic brand is constructed around untouched nature narratives, but this never translated into better allocation of resources for protecting nature or any type of enforced mechanism to deal with this kind of issues. You will see that sometimes it's just airbrushing at the European stage, whereas in the domestic legislation is happening something different. So I am not sure that most member states will feel burdened although the Commission has the mechanisms to impose sanctions, these processes take lot of time, and we see some infringement procedures related to illegal logging, for example, that can take years, and then governments change, and then there is a new shift. So it's a lot of political negotiations when we discuss district protection. But the influence that is felt harder is at the local level, where these areas are open for land grabbing, for green grabbing, for conservation purposes, and usually the states champion these kind of projects.
And so you might see at the local level protests or kind of the sort of EU top-down strategy.
Yes.
So it's like that might not necessarily be reflected in the Romanian government's to the Commission, but I know that there is definitely kind of more low regional protests around specific EU Commission laws and regulations. But with the second part, which is the question about challenging the neoliberal or capitalist logic, I'm not sure an answer to that. I personally seen from the work that I've done much pushback from many member states against the biodiversity strategies or EU laws as being too capitalist. I've not really seen states trying to embark on any kind of alternative discussions. I think that seems to I don't know what you think about that, George.
I think it's very recent to assess this, but there have been states, for example, like Poland and Hungary, who have opposed or who have voiced their opposition towards some parts of this strategy. We know that they are anyways Eurosceptic, and nature protection is not necessarily the hardest point in these countries. So I expect more opposition to be seen when this strategy will be put into law, because now it's mostly a proposal, a strategy.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find my mic for a second. Let's see. I was actually going to ask if any of the panelists have questions for one another. So that might be something you need to think about a little bit. In the meantime, I actually have a question for everyone. And this is also drawing on some of the comments that have been shared. And this is something that I've been thinking about in the past couple of years, especially with the talk around convivial conservation and decolonial approaches to conservation and things like that. So if we take these critiques on board, to decolonize conservation and radically rethink how it's done, what its objectives are, its successes and failures, considering the historical foundations and institutional foundations of kind of big C conservation as we think of it, wouldn't we probably need to call it something else? I mean, wouldn't the transformation be so big? What does a conservation without the coloniality of conservation we know look like? And that's for everyone, sorry.
I can have a stab. I really liked in Mathew's talk where you talked about promoted areas. I think that's, an interesting play on the same kinds of words. I mean, one of the things that we really tried to emphasize with the 3 different worlds in the transformative biodiversity futures, and I know that this contradicts what I'd said before about the need to grapple with trade-offs, maybe, but we really tried to emphasize in that the climate, biodiversity and sustainable development agendas are not separate. You can't, part of the problem is potentially an insularity between these things. I mean, this has potentially changed a little bit, but you know, in years gone by, you would go to a UNFCCC conference and no one would be talking about biodiversity. You go to a biodiversity conference, no one's talking about CBD conference, no one's talking about climate. You know, the SDGs potentially provides a framework that brings that kind of thing together, but we still have these discrete silos in the way that we talk about these things. So while that doesn't necessarily give me put forward an answer to your question around what it is that we would be calling this, I think that there is for sure a need to stop seeing all of these agendas as separate, and that, you know, social justice, climate justice, environmental justice, all of that is it just can't be separated, because we all live in one world.
Yeah. So also let me try to respond to Amber's question, which is, again, it's a very interesting question. But I think one thing to think about is to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of having, you know, the decolonial reconstruction? Why do we need to have decolonized conservation? So if I think if you are able to respond to the question, and then I think it could be a starting point. But for the case of conservation in Tanzania and Southern Africa more broadly, I think one of the purposes for having this discussion about decolonization of conservation science, policy, and practice is because of the social consequences that have been, you know, brought upon farmers and herders, you know, from the current approaches. You know, so the question here is the purpose here is to have conservation approaches that are socially just. You know? So that would be one of the ways to respond to your question. But also, I think the other way would be also to acknowledge that sometimes there's a need to have compromise, you know, and I think this has been arguments that was brought by Frantz Fanon, but also even Akile Mbembe talks about when it comes to decolonization of institutions and education systems and you know, these dominant structures. Sometimes there's a need to have a compromise, and I think this could also be the case for, you know, for conservation. And just reflecting on some of the questions that participants have asked in terms of you know, how to move away from the structures that are designing and are informing conservation targets. You know, so it's sometimes a compromise could also work. If the main purpose is realized to having a socially just conservation, and then for that case, some compromise could be attained if at all we achieve what we aim for with the decolonization of conservation. So yeah, I'm not sure if I responded to your question as you wished, but I could just add to what Karina said earlier.
Thanks. It's a difficult question.
Maybe one thing also to add. I think I had this discussion with one of my mentors. I think there's also need to have sort of capacity building for Western scientists, you know, to understand these issues. You know, we have all been hearing about capacity building in southern countries, but also I think when it comes to the understanding of the coloniality of knowledge and its manifestation and the social injustices that have been produced. So I think also some sort of capacity building for Western scientists to understand where they sit, decision-making rooms. They should be aware of what decisions are going to the implication of what they are deciding. They should be aware other ways of understanding the human-environment interactions. They should be aware of other voices that could be quite important when making decisions about conservation targets and conservation policies.
Sorry, I was just keeping up with the comments shared in the chat. There have been a few comments shared, not any questions. But we are nearing, yeah, many people like what you said, Mathew. Thank you. We are nearing the closing time for this keynote. And I would just like to ask if any of the panelists have any final thoughts before handing it back to Rosaleen.
I just want to say, I think that that I took from Karina's talk that I also thought was key to everything that we've all discussed today is that the future will be a composite of good and bad, and that it's probably unrealistic to try and think about conservation future a utopian way, and that we need to accept that there will be failures and there will be losses, but that doesn't mean that we can't move forward into a more socially just conservation arena that has also prioritizes like multi-species justice too. So I think that's what my big takeaway from today has been, and I want to thank all the other speakers because it's a really interesting conversation.
Rosaleen, do you have any final thoughts for the panel or attendees?
Yes, I mean, I just want to thank all the panelists for their contributions. I think that's been great. And as well to respond to one of the comments in the chat box from Jessica Jane Lavelle, and I think that's absolutely right. Is that we can in forums like Pollen and elsewhere to move beyond participation and really kind of generate those forums for active listening and bring in Indigenous perspectives and give platforms for other forms of knowledge. I think that's come through very strongly from all of the participants, all the speakers today, is that the coloniality of knowledge is deeply problematic. And I think all of us, well, many of us have faced a kind of almost policing of our knowledge when we've tried to present critical perspectives to conservation audiences, where we can be either criticised or excluded from those sort of more powerful forums that want to continue with business as usual. So just to finally say, and thank you to the Pollen organisers for going online at quite late notice as well. For them, it's been a lot of extra work, and just to encourage everyone to tune into the plenary later on today on feminist approaches to political ecology, which I think will be really fascinating and really have some really important insights as well. So thanks everyone.
Thank you, Rosaleen, and thank everybody.
Everyone, thanks Rosaleen. It's been a really fascinating panel, and thanks to all the other speakers. I've learned lots and really enjoyed the time.